Well, our lots of territory to cover here with our weather, and I think I'll cutting to the chase here though with the obvious issue of dryness over much of the state and region. It's very likely to continue, and we'll talk more about that in a second. There are some changes suggested next week, but the real bottom line is there's more of the same that we're looking at here, at least in the near term and even medium term future. And I'll get to that here shortly. But again, a lot to talk about. And for the last week, no big surprises here, other than if we look at mean temperatures, and that's not a very exciting one, but for the last week on the left-hand side here, it was cool early in the week, and then of course it got warmer and warmer, and now we're dealing with temperatures generally 10 to 20 degrees above normal, and that will be the case certainly again today and into the weekend as well. But when you look at the averages here for the last week, generally very close to normal, even a degree or two below normal in the far eastern part of the lower peninsula, to 2 or 3 degrees above normal in the west. So a little bit of location dependence, but that again masks a change over time as we went to warmer conditions. On the right-hand side, that's the real news here, or not news, but certainly reinforces what most people have been experiencing here. And you can see almost no color on the map at all. Virtually no precipitation for the vast majority of the state, a couple spots. And a note that this only goes through 8 o'clock yesterday morning. There were some very fortunate people in northwestern lower that did pick up a couple scattered showers yesterday afternoon that are not reflected here. That'll show up on next week's map, but the vast majority of the state, and note, not just the state, but the region, central and eastern Corn Belt, same story, dry. And we just don't see that very often here for a whole week to go without any precip, but we are certainly in a pattern conducive for this and have been, and I'm going to talk more about that in a second. If we look at the month of May, I wanted to point this out because I think it does really start to focus in on where the concern is greatest here. These are monthly totals for the month of May, the observed totals on the left-hand side here, and then the percent of normal, or that expressed in a percent of normal on the right-hand side. But there were some spots you can see in upper Michigan, particularly the central upper peninsula, that picked up over 4 inches. This includes that big snowstorm, and it's hard to even talk about that or think about talking about that now, but those totals reflected in that really heavy event up there. But most of certainly the lower peninsula, especially the central lower, that's the driest area. Most areas only seeing a half to 1 inch. And if you go over to the right-hand side here, that again translates to in some cases, less than 25% of normal. So right now, relative to climatology, the driest area of the state, the central lower, and then spreading south and east from there down towards the Ohio and Indiana borders. And it's obviously most of the state now has become, certainly recently become drier than normal. Historically, this May, at many central lower peninsula locations will rank, unfortunately, in the top 5 driest on record, and those records go back some time. So it's for many of those spots, it's been all the way back to 1988 was the last year that we saw with a May that dry. It's been some time, unfortunately, and I want to spend a little bit of time on that to put for some perspective. I'm going to use Grand Rapids as a location as somewhat representative, but certainly in the central lower peninsula, most of the records look like this. This is an accumulating precipitation graphic, dates on the horizontal axis down at the bottom, and then you've got accumulated precipitation on the vertical. The green is the observed precipitation total at Grand Rapids, and the brown is the normal accumulation for that site chronologically. And you can clearly see here since the beginning of the calendar year that initially precipitation was running at or above normal. That was especially the case during the month of March. You can see this big jump here at Grand Rapids, where we went from about 8 inches of accumulation all the way up to 13 inches. So March was a very, very wet month. But since the early part of April, and that's where you see this sort of plateauing effect of the graphic here, April and especially then after the first week of May, very, very little or no precipitation. So most of April and May have been abnormally dry, and that's, of course, the concern right now. You can see some of the numbers here that while this entire time frame here, that's a 5-month period that we're looking at here, that we do have very close to normal or even a little bit wetter than normal conditions in terms of total precip. If we only look at the last 8 weeks, the beginning of early April through the end of May, big deficit, almost 5.5 inches at this location. And of course, the timing is not good because we're running into gradually increasing water needs for most of our agricultural crops, and that's of course at the head of the focus of the concern here. As a result of this, looking at this has not been just exclusive to Michigan. It's been larger scale. This is a short-term drought index from the National Drought Information System out of Lincoln. And you can see that in Michigan, we do now have some areas, at least in terms of short-term dryness, that are up into that moderate, even to severe category. And that's, again, the worst of it relative to precipitation is in the central lower. Now, it's also important to note that impacts with this vary. And what we have here, because we had the earlier heavy precipitation, there definitely is moisture at depth in the profile. The problems, of course, are in the topsoils, and in the top foot, maybe 1.5 feet. That's where things have really dried out over the last few weeks. And so it's hard to generalize, but that's especially true on lighter, coarse textured soils that do not hold as much water. And you can see that visually, and certainly with lawns and also with forages and so forth in areas that have now begun to senesce. And that's very unusual, of course, to see that in Michigan at this time of the year, but it reflects this trend or pattern that we just showed. Now, one of the questions, and we've had many questions at the climate office here in East Lansing over the last week or so from media, but also from farmers, from a number of people. And one of the questions is how does this year compare to 1988? And many of you know and remember, and if you're old enough like me, you know that 1988 was the benchmark worst drought in Michigan and certainly much of the Midwest of the second half of last century. It's a company that you don't want to be in, certainly, but that was the last time we saw. Well, then there are a couple things, and it's sort of a mixed, I think, comparison. There are unfortunately real similarities with what happened in 1988. This is also looking now at that accumulated precipitation, daily precipitation totals. You've got 1987, 88 on the left-hand side, because I've also gone back to the preceding fall, to October of the previous year through the end of May, and that's the time frame. And then on the right-hand side here, you see basically the same time frame during the year, except this is the current season, so 2022, 2023. And the not good, the bad news is that for the last 2 months, for April and May, there are many similarities with 1988, certainly in terms of actual precipitation that fell very low. I mentioned one of the top 5 driest Mays on record at many sites. It's not as bad in other areas, but the other similarity is with 1988. 1988 was a classic early onset drought. And most of the droughts that cause economic problems and damage and have issues here in Michigan, they're more of a mid or even sometimes a later season variety. That's more common climatologically to see that happen, not at the beginning of the growing season like we had in 1988. Well, this one, of course, is at the early part of the season, and like it was in 1988. And I mentioned the numbers are similar, but there's a very important distinction between the two, and that is that 1988, the drought then, it followed an unusually dry winter and spring. and that was not the case in this year. And again, this is at one site, but it's pretty representative. We look at other series, we'll see the same thing, and you can see that basically it shifted the distribution. The total precipitation this year is much above, and really what we're looking at here in terms of number, we had a deficit already going into the growing season back in '88 of several inches. We don't have that this year. And so that goes back to my comment about soil types. There are going to be differing impacts based on the soil type and how much water it holds. But the big difference between what happened back in the 80s and late 80s with '88 is that season came in, and we likely, it was one of the few years in Michigan that we did not have a complete recharge of soil moisture. And that's a great thing about Michigan and our climate. And we look at this, and it's very consistent year to year. We rarely go into the season without having near field capacity, especially at lower layers of and that comes in it's a very, very important factor, of course, during the course of the growing season. Well, this year we still have moisture. It's at depth, but it is, of course, being depleted, and the topsoils are abnormally dry. So I wanted to make that's an important distinction, I think, that we do need to make. So where are we headed? Well, I mentioned at the beginning, we're looking at more of the same. Our weather map here this morning, you can see high pressure over Ontario. That's the major factor. It has been, and there's a couple little nuances. This is a very warm and mostly dry air mass. We've actually got air flowing around from the east and south coming back up into Michigan on the surface, and that is leading to some of the transport of smoke from forest fires out in the Canadian Maritimes. And this time it's not Alberta, British Columbia, Saskatchewan. It's actually the eastern Maritimes that's coming around the back of that. And that's leading to some of the hazy conditions that we see in Michigan currently. It's also leading to some air quality advisories across Michigan again today. That will be the case, and that's what you're wondering where. Well, that's where it's from. It's from the Northeast and from the eastern Canada. So it's a different place, but this similar result with the degradation in air quality. But there's one other interesting thing today. We will see hot conditions again here today in Michigan. More in the way of humidity today than we've had over the last couple of days. I mentioned some showers up in northwestern lower Michigan managed to pop up yesterday. We'll see the same thing today, and probably further south across western portions of lower Michigan. Here is the weather map for this afternoon, and you actually can see some precipitation here in the western lower portions of upper Michigan. Now, this is not widespread rain. These are well, scattered at best and isolated, and something you might see in the distance. But at least for the western couple tiers of counties in the lower Michigan and then the western half of upper Michigan, we will see a real chance of some at least scattered shower and thunder shower activity. If you're lucky enough to be under one of those clouds or one of those individual cells, you might pick up a couple tenths of rain. But again, the reality of stepping back is that most areas will remain dry, and maybe just see that from a distance. Central and eastern portions of lower Michigan will remain mostly sunny and dry like they were yesterday, and we'll see the same today. And that will also be the case moving then into the weekend, with more hot and dry conditions expected to continue. Here's Friday morning, more of the same on Saturday. Now, there are some changes, though, that I mentioned that they're not very promising in terms of precipitation, but they definitely should lead to some changes in temperature. Here's Saturday morning. You can see a frontal boundary in the state. Typically, that means maybe some opportunity for clouds and precipitation, but because the air mass that we're dealing with is so dry and warm, virtually no. It's going to continue to be dry. One exception to that would be upper Michigan, the western half of upper Michigan. We will still see some scattered shower and thunder shower activity possible during the afternoon and early evening hours, both tomorrow on Friday and then into Saturday. But that's the only place I think in Michigan that we'll see that. The rest of the state and areas to our south will remain warm and dry. Well, early next week or late this weekend into early next week, there will be a subtle but still significant change in our upper airflow. this big, on the left-hand side here, looking at jet stream flow, this big upper ridge, which is the reason why we're hot and dry right now. It's right over the top of us, and that's just a dominating feature. But the key is that it is projected to basically edge off to the west. And you can see that here, the axis of this ridge moves out to the high plains and even into the parts of the front range of the Rockies. And just as importantly, over the east, we can see the formation of a big upper air trough or cutoff feature here, almost cutoff feature here. And if you look at the circulation around that being counterclockwise, we're going to have our winds, upper air winds, shift more out of the north than they have been, certainly over the last several days. And so there will be a change with that. And the change will be in terms of temperature. And they'll probably see at least a couple different cool frontal passages moving in from north, even from the northeast to southwest is what we're likely to see here, so-called backdoor cold fronts that will result in at least some cooling of our day-to-day temperatures. Normally, we would also see a chance for precip. This case, because the air's so dry, it's not as strong. So look for one of those frontal passages probably late in the weekend, and then another one probably around. This is a forecast here that you're looking at for next Tuesday at 8 o'clock in the morning, the 6th of June. And with that second one, there's even a chance that we could see maybe some showers. For most of the state, that will be maybe the only chance other than today in the western part of the state. That might be the only chance for any precipitation. But again, it is not expected to be anything widespread or really significant just because there's just not much moisture available. But it will result in a noticeable change in temperature. And in contrast to being 10 to 20 degrees above normal like we are now, probably more on the order of 5 to 8 degrees above normal by the middle of next week. So our high temperatures, which are now in the upper 80s and low 90s for the next few days, they'll cool back down probably to the upper 70s to near 80 by the middle of next week. So that, and with that, of course, the water demand, the potential of evapotranspiration rates that we look at, those will also at least decrease somewhat by the middle of next week. But the big news though is there's not much moisture with that. And if we look at the precipitation forecast for the next 7 days, once again, for much of the eastern Corn Belt and for the Great Lakes, little or no precipitation. The green you see in western lower Michigan there, that's what's expected or possible here this afternoon with those showers. Other than that, virtually no chance for precip for the next week. And that's unusual for us. And that pattern, unfortunately, continues. High potential evapotranspiration rates expected to continue, not surprisingly, at or even a little bit above 1/4 of an inch per day. Remember, again, that's not the actual water use. That's what could evaporate if the water were present on the surface. Again, this well-watered, level, unshaded, grass-covered surface that we use as a reference. But those numbers are really, they're way up there. That's something we just don't see in Michigan that often, especially for this long. So the bottom line, the potential water demand for any crop out there that's growing is going to be much, much larger or higher than it typically is for this time of the year. And that's likely to continue again into next week. So where do we go beyond the short term here? And I hate to talk about a pattern here, but it's very similar. The upper air pattern for the 6 to 10 and 8 to 14 day outlooks, you can see that ridge. This is fairly similar to what we saw here just a couple of images ago. The ridge axis has shifted out to the west with troughing over eastern North America, and Michigan sort of in here in between with northwesterly flow aloft. I mentioned a little bit of a cooling, but over time, most of the guidance still suggests it will be at or even a bit above normal. The bigger news that is the precipitation. Whether, now it is important, where does this ridge axis and where does the trough set up, and where east-west, where is Michigan under that? That will have a major influence on the temperatures. However, both of those, regardless of whether we're under the influence more of the trough or the ridge, both of them unfortunately are dry patterns for Michigan. So there isn't right now, there isn't much of it doesn't look like much of an opportunity for anything more active in terms of precipitation. Then unfortunately that pattern is going to continue for the next week or two. And finally, and this is very recent, There was an update of our June outlook here yesterday afternoon that came out from the Climate Prediction Center, and it is not a good update for much of, certainly much of our part of the world. Up on top here, mean temperatures now forecast to be clearly warmer than normal during the month of June, or average out. But the big news was, or is, that the drier than normal pattern continues for the 30-day. That is a significant change from the last 2 weeks ago, the issuance of this outlook. We were in the equal chances, so no forecast direction. And if you go back before that, expectations were for a wetter pattern. You can see below this our current June, July, and August 3-month outlook. Well, equal chances, so no direction on mean temperatures, but that normal to above normal precipitation pattern that you see in the lower right hand. We saw that for most of the summer months, including June earlier, but that has now changed. There are a couple of reasons for that, but some of it is just the dryness that has developed, and that tends to tends to be a continuity as the landscape dries out, and we see the old saying, drought begets drought, from the Great Plains. There is some physical truth to that, or some memory to that, as well as the numerical forecast guidance that you just saw from the medium range. And so again, it's likely that this warm and dry scenario does persist at least through the first half of June, and possibly longer than that. Again, that is not encouraging news, but that's the most recent change. There was also an update to our drought outlook here from Climate Prediction Center, and now for the first time you can see in the lower left-hand corner here, there's a large area, not just Michigan, but much of the central and eastern Corn Belt that is in this same area of concern, of growing dryness, and unfortunately the likelihood of continuation of warm, dry conditions. So we're stuck with this pattern for a little while, and we'll be looking for any sign of a change on the horizon. But right now we don't see anything, at least immediate, other than some cooler air next week. So wrapping up here, more of the same, certainly for the short term, but we will see some cooling by next week. Maybe a couple lucky areas here pick up some showers this afternoon, but it is the pattern that we're in is unfortunately a stubborn one, and it's going to be a little bit of time before we move to something different. And as you just saw, also that's expected to continue with the new medium range guidance into June. And I'll stop there, at least with the weather, and move ahead here in the interest of time, and introduce next week's virtual breakfast. And you'll note that there's no individual speaker here. It's because we're going to have one of our special question and answer session here with hot topics. So bring it's an open forum, open mic, and you can ask questions on everything, because you basically have all of the specialists with MSU Extension here to talk about a number of whatever you want to ask and talk about. That's where we go next week, and again, that's on the 8th of June.